Good morning and welcome. My name is Scott Miller. I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS and hold the Scholl Chair in International Business. We welcome you to this breakout session. You had three wonderful choices, so I'm glad you chose ours this morning, and we look forward to a robust discussion. This panel, like all the others, will be recorded and it's being webcast live. But if you want to look at the other panels that you didn't get a chance to attend, the breakout sessions, they'll be available at csis.org after today's event. Our topic today is the risks and consequences of a trade war. It's an interesting topic, but it's one that is quite relevant. The rules-based trading system is a hallmark of the post-World War II global order, but all has not been well in the trading system for some time now. If you look at the multilateral agreements, the GATT 94 is still the most recent rule set, and yet in the last 17 years since the conclusion of GATT 94, we've experienced this thing that Richard Baldwin calls globalization 2.0. When GATT 94 was being negotiated, most of industrial goods trade took place among industrial democracies, large ones like the G7. It's a different world today. I don't need to tell you that, but the system has been able to move forward and address the changes that have happened very rapidly to production, distribution, trade over that period of time. In terms of other intermediate organizations, the G20 has made, since its inaugural G20 event, has made repeated pledges to avoid protection, yet an NGO based in Geneva called the Global Trade Alert points out that there are nearly 8,000 new restrictive trade measures by G20 economies since 2008. So it's a problem. Here in the United States, we've lost momentum on liberalization and market opening. I would point out that one of our panelists would know this personally, but the last U.S. free trade agreement that actually became law concluded negotiations. It was signed in 2007. So it's been 10 years since the United States has actually negotiated, concluded, and implemented a free trade agreement. In other words, there's not a bright picture around anywhere. Into this situation enters President Trump with a campaign narrative of unfairness to American workers. Basically, the theme of many of candidate Trump's campaign speeches was that this rules-based order was an opportunity for our leaders and to give away benefits that would have been accrued to American workers to others, and that wound up with a lot of unfair trade agreements that he intends to fix. This narrative of unfairness is paired with the president's current focus and continued focus on the industrial base in the United States. That leads us to a point where we're not only in a different world, in a world that has not been improved as conditions have changed, but now we're at risk of falling back into things that really haven't happened since, in a broad range way, since before the wars. In any case, I'm delighted to be here today. We're going to have a vigorous discussion, mostly because I have a fabulous panel. So let me briefly introduce. The bios are available to you, but I'll introduce them in order, and we'll get this thing going. Wendy Cutler, Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, is a retired trade official, longtime trade official, was the leader of negotiations for the, I got your title wrong, but CORUS, U.S. Korea FTA was Wendy's product. She ended her ultimate job was as acting deputy USTR, very experienced practitioner that we have, and we're always delighted when Wendy makes an appearance at CSIS. I have two CSIS colleagues here, Matt Goodman, Senior Advisor and Simon Chair in Political Economy, and Chris Johnson, Senior Advisor and Freeman Chair in China Studies, both of whom are well known to CSIS audiences. And finally, in alphabetical order but not in contribution, Colin Robertson. Colin is Vice President and Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Colin's a career diplomat for the Government of Canada and was basically present at the creation of lots of the major trade agreements, including GATT 94, the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and NAFTA. And so we're delighted to have everyone here. You've gotten your practice on the clickers if you attended the plenary session. We will have one practice round just in case you need to sharpen your clicker skills as we get going. But what we're going to do today is examine, what are the risks of further deterioration? When you voted for sort of the questions on the trading system, you concluded the world was in a muddle, which is what we conclude as well. And what we're going to talk about today is what's the downside risk? What is the risk particularly of the U.S. provoking further deterioration? And what are the consequences for globally engaged firm and for the U.S., its allies, and our trading partners around the world? So with that, let me just, before we start the clickers, let me ask each of our panelists in turn, what's your view of the situation overall? First, are we right to be concerned? And second, in your opinion, what's behind the tensions that we sense now? Wendy, could I start with you?
Sure, and thank you. It's always great to be on a panel with my CSIS colleagues and my Canadian colleague. Yeah, I think there's a real reason to be concerned about trade and trade policy now, particularly if you're a former U.S. trade negotiator and you're seeing some of the agreements that you worked on very hard and seeing them possibly unravel. And we're also seeing kind of an unprecedented use of U.S. trade laws, and where this all ends up, I'm sure we'll be discussing that more this morning. But I will say, just taking a step back, I agree with what Scott said, kind of his take on how we ended up where we've ended up. But I would also add, as a practitioner, as a former U.S. trade negotiator, that looking back on it, maybe we were also on autopilot and that things were changing and we weren't keeping up with those changes. And particularly when you look at a negotiation like TPP, which took 5 years to negotiate, it means that many of the proposals we put on the table, that was about 7 years ago. And as the negotiations proceeded, it's hard just to take an issue off the table or completely pivot. And so I would also say that was a phenomenon that was happening, that we were not keeping up with what was going on. We knew what worked in the past. We kept on that route. I would just conclude, just a specific example, the issue of investor-state dispute settlement, which has become so controversial, and this administration is taking a new approach on it. We saw at USTR that the consensus for this issue, not only in the U.S., but all over Asia and in Latin America, was beginning to disintegrate. And instead of just questioning, should we just take this off the table, what we did, we made important improvements to improve transparency and to put the burden of proof more on the complainant. But looking back on all of this, I just wonder, did we kind of lose sight with developments that were occurring in our country and around the world?
Matt?
Well, thanks, Scott. And look, of course, there's lots to be worried about. I think the rules-based order is clearly under stress, and I think it's under stress from without and from within. It's from without in the sense that players that have not had as much of a role in shaping the rules are complaining that they want more voice in doing that, and I think in other ways are challenging the system. And then from within, we have not delivered in the way that the system used to deliver the outcomes, the equal or the more widely shared outcomes that the rules-based order delivered. And so I think it's clearly under stress. Not fully broken and not something that shouldn't be fixed. I think that it's definitely, the system continues to deliver broad benefits for most people around the world, and I think it's got issues that need to be addressed and fixed, again, both in terms of how the system's governed and how it delivers to a broader base of people. But in my view, when something is fundamentally sound and good and delivers broad benefits, but has challenges, you try to fix those problems. You don't try and throw the whole thing away. So I think that's the challenge for all of us, is to figure out how to achieve both broader participation in shaping the rules and better, broader outcomes from the system.
Thank you, Chris. What's this look like with regard to U.S.-China relations?
Yeah, stick to my lane on that one. I think to the degree that these forces that both Matt and Wendy highlighted are manifested in the China case, it is the across-the-board surprise, I think, to most people in the globe of China's ability to decouple on a number of fronts from these international regimes, or in some cases to deconstruct them and refashion them, or try to, in their own sort of image. And I think that's a significant piece. I think the other significant piece is that, in some ways, one of my frustrations with the recent coverage of China's 19th Party Congress and Xi Jinping's speech and so on, so much emphasis on China and what it's doing, almost no emphasis on what we're not doing. If there's no counter narrative that's out there that, like TPP, that can, both highlight the strengths of China's system, but also cast a light on its weaknesses, then things like Xi Jinping's message that China has found a third way between socialism and capitalism that works, and so on, they start to sound more real because there's no significant counter narrative out there, and I think that's a big issue. I think the other issue is that we see, again, this idea of decoupling. A lot of, and this is broad-based, it's not just in economics and trade for China, a general disenchantment with the notion of if we open everything up and bring them in, they will join, the rules-based global order. And I think in some significant sectors, we've not seen that happen, and that's been surprising. And increases in Chinese industrial policy and Chinese sort of protectionism have caught a lot of people by surprise. They really shouldn't, I would argue, given the system that they have, but they have. And then again, I think so much of this is just magnified by what the U.S. is not doing or how we're retreating from the front lines.
That the responsible stakeholder narrative is in some trouble. So, Colin, there's no closer observer of the United States than Canadians. For good or ill, you have to deal with us. But what's this look like from outside?
Well, I think these are wrenching moments, and I think back to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement when Canada was deeply divided. We were a trading nation, but did we become a nation of traders? Could we compete? And it, as I say, very dividing within our country. We've had an election on it. 43% of the population voted for, because our parliamentary system voted for the Conservative government, and free trade took effect. And then we enjoyed, and we continue to enjoy, prosperity, and it has done a tremendous amount for Canadian self-confidence in vis-a-vis the United States, but also with the rest of the world. And when you commented that the situation looks bleak, I'd remind you that we've just done a trade agreement with Europe, and we're looking at reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the 11, looking at a deal with the ASEAN nations, potentially with China, where we've improved our sort of situation with the Pacific Alliance. So for us, this was a moment of confidence we got over. I would say with the Mexicans that the 1994 agreement really did pivot them forward, and the latest reforms, the Peña Nieto on energy and labor and finance and education, or a continuation of what the course that the Mexicans took in joining the NAFTA. So I'd say that this is now America's moment, and Canada and Mexico, of course, hope it will go a certain direction. But this is really about the United States. What sort of country? What does it want to continue to be? Uphold the rules-based liberal international system that it created and has led, or is it going to retrench? And I think you got a sense of that in some of the polling as to where things might go. I can tell you, having been in Asia and Europe and Africa and the Middle East in the last 6 months, that there is very careful an interest on where the United States is going. And as you say, because we look and sound mostly the same, we're constantly asked what we think. And to use an American expression, I'd say it's jump ball. We certainly hope it goes in the right direction. And I think that what I'm impressed by right now is that there's a basically for 20 years, the proponents of free trade, we weren't there in this country. And I mean, we're there, you were there, but it was an elite kind of sport, but it's no longer the elite sport. And with the farm community, the chambers of commerce, we're starting to see a kind of reaction. And this is even up on Capitol Hill. So how all that plays out, we are watching with great interest, and we certainly hope it goes a certain way. And because we have big interests, we will try to gently steer it in a certain direction. Our Prime Minister is determined to have a good relationship with President Trump, and I think he handles him pretty well. We will not walk out of the NAFTA talks. I don't think Mexico will either. But the NAFTA talks are seen as a litmus test by much of the rest of the world because of its implications for, obviously, Korea and the World Trade Organization. So,
Thank you. Okay, here's our first question. So this is a goofy one to get your clicker fingers working again. So find your device, and we're talking about the president's trip to Asia. So we'll warm up. How will the president's trip to Asia affect U.S.-China economic policy? Everything from long-term easing of questions to things will get much worse. So we'll see how coherent the audience is. Well, that's 48 of you. 49, there we go, okay. Looks like what my stats prof would have called a normal distribution, or something close to it. Yes, with most of you, I think the center is the mean of the opinion, which is no significant change. That's, I mean, for what it's worth, Chris would know best, but that's probably right. A single visit is probably not dispositive of anything. But thank you. Now that you got your clicker warmed up, let's turn to the first serious question. And this one has to do with one of the things that happens before any war is the peacekeepers get removed. Right at the moment, there's some sort of under the surface things happening that are making it harder to do settlements based on rules and more likely to do settlements based on power. There are three factors. One is the United States has taken initiatives to basically reduce the impact of the WTO dispute settlement understanding, mostly by blocking the appointment of panelists. Second, the United States has been famous over the last 10 months for picking fights with its allies, okay, which doesn't help when you are trying to accomplish something strategic. And finally, the third element is there has been a rise in the use of what we call trade remedy laws, anti-dumping laws and subsidy laws, countervailing duty laws. I'm calling this stealth protection because not a lot of people notice it on a daily basis, but it is noticeable to our trading partners. In the case of Canada, dumping case and subsidy case with Bombardier aircraft versus Boeing. The never-ending softwood lumber case is back in the forefront. We're fighting about sugar with Mexico. So all this is happening. So which one of these do you think might be the biggest trouble? Well, that's interesting. And certainly something that is not helping in this situation is if you want to lead, it's hard to when you tussle with your opponents. So let me turn to the panel. Let me start with Colin, just because a lot of that picking fights with your enemy is happening with our neighbors, is happening to our north.
I hope we're not enemy. The question being,
is this the thing that is going to lead us toward a disintegration of rules-based solutions for problems? Are we moving away into sort of power politics when it comes to trade, which is basically the pre-GATT model, is big countries get their way and small countries don't?
well, that's the sort of spheres of influence approach that,
Yeah.
that I think that the Chinese and the Russians would like to see. But again, I go back to that. That's not the model that was that the Americans led and shepherded and created institutions around. And so I do think that it is obliging now the rest of the world, that is the rest of the democratic nations, to sort of say, okay, we may have, there may have been some free riding, as Mr. Trump has suggested, especially on the defense side. So if you look at since this year, certainly my own country, we're almost increasing our defense expenditures by 50%, which is the last thing a progressive liberal redistributionist government ever wanted to do, but an acknowledgement of the changing situation. And I think you see this in Europe, the NATO contributions that Robert Gates and successive presidents talked about, that you've got to do more. The people are doing more. I think that in Korea, to talk about role of middle powers, I think there's a sense that middle powers, like Canada, like Mexico, many of the European powers, Asian, we will have to step into the gap. You can't fill it.
Right.
But and the hope is that this, as the United States goes through this period of introspection and insularity, that it will come out of it soon. We may have to wait till the next election, but
So you're playing the long game, essentially.
we have no choice but to
Right.
play the long game.
Makes sense. Chris, if I could ask you, does China really care about this? And given that the president is focused intently on trade deficits, and right or wrong, 2/3 of our trade deficit was with China, and yet here we are renegotiating NAFTA and chorus. How does this play in Beijing?
Yeah, I think they do care about it from the perspective of the degree to which they perceive it to be creating opportunity for them. I think, as President Xi prepares to welcome President Trump tomorrow in Beijing, he's certainly been watching the previous stops. I haven't really absorbed what happened in Seoul today, but I think certainly the mixed message we saw yesterday in Japan and over the last 48 hours of golf and hamburgers, and then you're number two and always will be, and trade disputes and so on, and buy more U.S. defense equipment. This doesn't help the case, and I think it encourages China to feel that they have more room to pressure other countries. Something that's been surprising to me, just as an Asianist, is that when I going back really to the president's election and shortly thereafter, traveling around Asia and start hearing about all this talk about NAFTA, and you sort of think, why do you guys care about NAFTA? I mean, at the end of the day, and the view is obviously, if you're willing to destroy something like that is such an obvious benefit to you, what are you going to do to me? And bilateral agreements we may have, with you and so on. And especially in the case of the Korean free trade agreement, you see this constant tension, it seems, with USTR, Lighthizer, and others, where we like chorus because it doesn't affect some of the core constituencies that NAFTA does, and then Secretary Mattis comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, in the current geostrategic context, we can't possibly do that to the Koreans, and they seem to go back and forth between those two agreements as to which is the bigger target on an almost daily basis. And I think the main piece in terms of how China and the whole region perceive it is, in Asia, economics is security. So if you don't have an economic strategy, you're not playing on security in a way that matters. And I think that this gives China the ability to sort of perceive open field running with no tackling, really, on the issue. I found it striking when I was in Beijing a couple weeks back. It was the first time I can remember officials on their side actually looking forward to APEC. Typically they don't like APEC because, it doesn't work for them. Yeah, exactly. And, suddenly they were looking forward to it. That's a big change.
Wow, thanks. Wendy, if I ask you to follow up particularly on Korea, because that's you own this piece of the puzzle. But.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to watch
Yes.
what we're doing with Korea now. On one hand, I fully agree that there have been issues with respect to full implementation of the agreement, but let's work on those issues. But in terms of trying to amend this agreement, it's unclear to me what the bandwidth is on the Korean side for the types of amendments that the U.S. may be looking for. And also, is the U.S. really prepared to make any concessions to Korea? Because Korea, like any trading partner, would have to bring this deal home and gain domestic support for the deal. And so I noted coming out of the meetings today that both sides have agreed to expedite this process. I hope it's expedite, reach successful conclusion, and move on. I think we need to keep chorus intact, and I think that our trading partners are not only watching NAFTA really closely, particularly in Asia, they're really watching chorus. And if this administration wants to pursue bilateral negotiations with other Asian trading partners, and at the same time make it very difficult for Korea or this process with Korea ends up in failure, then I think their ability to entice other countries to come to the negotiating table will be weakened. With respect to this question, just two observations. One is that some of these trading issues, you need to reach what I call plurilateral solutions to. So you take steel overcapacity. We just can't solve that with China. We need to work with other countries. And in fact, we're doing that in the OECD. But if you're taking your friends and your allies on in other negotiating contexts, sometimes they don't want to work with you on issues that you really care about. And I would also say that I think with respect to some of the barriers and practices we're seeing China undertake, I think it's very important to have a group of countries dealing with China together, and I think that can be called into question. Second, I'm a little surprised by how low the WTO bar was. It's only 23%.
Not many trade wonks in the room.
Yeah, and I would just say this is kind of a sleeping issue.
Yeah.
But to the extent that the U.S. since 1995 has used the WTO dispute settlement procedures to solve a lot of our problems with China and with other countries, and frankly, we've done fairly well. If you look at our win rate, this chipping away of the WTO dispute settlement procedure, I think is something we should all be concerned about.
Can I just say 30 seconds? I mean, I think that's right. All three of these things are problems, and you should be paying attention to all three of them. But I think the audience, as always, is right, that I would have probably voted for that, the one about NAFTA, of course, because it reflects the problem of the U.S. not being really the one moving forward a positive agenda and keeping the bicycle moving forward, as they say. But actually, walking away from some of the things we've already done, and clearly that's going to undermine our ability to lead new initiatives, whether bilateral or multilateral. So I think all of these things are a real problem, and they come down to if the U.S. is not playing the game, then we're not moving forward.
That's a great point, and it's one thing to have a tough negotiating stance. It's another thing for Secretary Ross to state in an interview that in the NAFTA, I'm sorry, the United States doesn't have any concessions to make. Sorry. The Mexico and Canada have somehow been taking advantage of the United States for 23 years, and they're the ones who need to give, and not the United States. It's an odd stance, and it's hard to see a successful outcome with that mentality. So, but there's no question that would be contagious, and to both Colin and Wendy's point, everybody is watching what happens with the NAFTA. I mean, imagine yourself being the leader of a country that potentially could do a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. You look at what's happening in the NAFTA, you probably just get discouraged pretty quickly. So, in any case, let's move ahead to the next question, which is after you clear the peacekeepers off, there will be first contact. In other words, something precipitates it. And so this is the last wonky questions for you, those who are not trade experts, but there's 5 potentials here for what might really trigger it. The Section 232 are the national security investigations of steel and aluminum. Section 232 was in the Trade Act of 1962. It's a little used statute until Team Trump showed up. But basically, it has the aspect of being self-judging. All members of the WTO, all nations have the right to judge their own essential security. So it's carte blanche, but it would provoke both responses and potentially imitation. Second is the Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, and that's the investigation into Chinese intellectual property. That's very targeted. It's an investigation that will at some point finish and lead to recommendations that the president will decide. C is the safeguard question. There have been no safeguards. Is basically protection for an injured industry in the conditions of fair trade. So safeguards are, like hypocrisy, are the acknowledgement that vice pays to virtue. It's a political mechanism to protect sensitive industries. It has no economic rationale because in the condition of the safeguards only apply when the products are fairly traded. In the case, there are 2 safeguard investigations underway now, one in solar panels, the other in washing machines of all things. But they both have global effect. And if you're keeping score, the last 6 U.S. safeguard measures challenged at the WTO, the U.S. lost all 6 cases. our laws are probably not fully compliant with our obligations. So that's Section 201. And then the abrupt withdrawal from KORUS or NAFTA, you know what that would do, but how likely is that to be first? Finally, a tweet. Oh, we got a couple of tweets. So you never know. Thank you. But so now that you've heard the explanation from the wonks, 201s. That's interesting. That's a withdrawal. Withdrawal from NAFTA or KORUS is probably the precipitating event. It's an interesting audience response, which I actually kind of agree with, because in some ways, the rest of these investigations either can be managed or affect a relatively small share of total trade, and maybe may get a response but won't be catastrophic. But let me just open it up to the panel as comments on the audience's instincts about withdrawing from NAFTA being or KORUS being the trigger.
I mean, I think, on the three numbered trade tools, I actually think that depending on, I actually think if any of those are used against China, my guess is you get some retaliation. I mean, China will use, sort of stealth retaliation of one kind or another. All of a sudden, a bunch of Boeing sales will go to Airbus or something. Whether a formal, filing at the WTO happens, I think depends on how we use those tools. There are ways to use, 301, for example, in a way that doesn't necessarily violate the WTO. Smart lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've been told by smart lawyers, there are ways that one might creatively use 301 in a way that didn't actually violate the WTO. Although the point of it is not to do that. With Japan back in the 80s, when Wendy and I were first doing this stuff, we filed a lot of 301 cases against Japan, but we never once actually went to retaliation, we never went to raising tariffs or any action. We did raise tariffs in a non-301 case, but other than that, it all ended in either some sort of negotiated solution or a managed trade solution. That's not good if that's what happens with these things, but I think there is risk with all of this. I think I again agree with the audience that the biggest problem would be withdrawal from either one of those two existing agreements.
Matt, you make a good point about Section 301 and a lot of the 80s trade law. And it's easy to forget that this was before binding dispute settlement. The GATT had basically a non-binding or diplomatic resolution of disputes, which was not very effective. The response of Congress to the frustrations with the lack of success at the GATT was largely, that's what created Section 301 in the first place. And it was used throughout the 80s before sort of the WTO was formed and with binding dispute settlement. But there's somewhat gauzy history about 301, which you mentioned, Matt, which is it actually worked better when you didn't take action than when you did. Okay, so the investigation seemed to be the real value of this. You pointed out the problems, and then you entered into some negotiated settlement with the target. Okay, but actually imposing trade remedies or sanctions of some sort didn't seem to change the other party's behavior. And so, any other comments, Chris?
Yeah, I would just say quickly on the China 301 2 points. I mean, one, I think there's a real debate not only about the use of 301, but is the 301 process that we're engaged in actually in some ways fighting the last war with China, by focusing on IP theft and cyber and so on, when the real challenge is their efforts to compete with us on the outer rim of technological advancement, whether it be AI, quantum computing, 5G, et cetera. They have serious programs, in all those, and actually you see a strong diminution in the type of activity that's targeted at. And then the second is, Wendy's earlier point about how do we work together with allies and partners to co-manage this problem. And 301s, as Matt pointed out, people have experience with 301s. And when we encourage them, hey, why don't you do something 301-like yourselves on China as well, they're reluctant to do so because of their own experience. And so it seems like a bad tool to me.
I'd say in terms of the trade remedy action, I looked at the Commerce Department press release on Boeing, and there's almost relish in the things that we have increased threefold the highest number of trade actions since the 90s on the part of the administration. Okay, you can take that, but I do think that the NAFTA and KORUS if you can't get on with the two neighbors, who can you get on with? And Korea, given the strategic importance of what's going on over there, again, this is why it is troubling. And in all of these cases, the other partners, Canada, Mexico, and Korea, say, okay, we'll reform, we'll revise, but let's do it in a way that, as Mr. Pence said, win-win-win. But that's not the approach, as you described earlier, Mr. Ross and Mr. Lighthizer.
Thanks.
So let me just comment on something no one else in the panel's commented on, and that's kind of the sleeper issue on this list, and that's the Section 232 investigations on steel and aluminum. I think we should be concerned about those should an outcome become public soon. One, it affects a lot of our trading partners, including China, the EU, Korea, Canada, Japan. Two, it touches upon an area of national security where there's kind of a gentleman's agreement in the WTO. You only use this really sparingly. And if we were to use this for aluminum and steel, I fear that this will just open the doors for other countries to start enthusiastically restricting imports also based on national security considerations. The other issue I would just raise with number 1 through 4, this is put forward as kind of an either-or.
Yes.
There's kind of a perfect storm here, and that is that all 4 happened around the same time.
Yes, very interesting point, Wendy. And it's certainly, and when it comes to 232, it comes to national security declarations. The gentleman's agreement has been very important over time, and this is a case where it's not so much retaliation as it is imitation by parties who, over the years, the United States and others have discouraged from, declaring essential security for some element of their trading system. And when we start to do it, then it's kind of as Wendy puts it, open season. But it's right. I would actually, interesting crisis brewing for the first quarter of 2018. You heard it here first. The president will have on his desk the safeguard recommendations from the ITC and the Department of Commerce for both washing machines and solar panels. They will be at the end of the statutory time frame on the 232 investigations. The NAFTA negotiations are only scheduled through March, and from a matter of political practicality, the Mexican government probably is unable to deliver concessions much after March because of their own electoral schedule. And the Congress, the president will have to ask the Congress to renew trade promotion authority or extend it for 3 years by April 21st, subject to a resolution of disapproval by the Congress. So there's one opportunity for Congress to take away the matches, but otherwise it's going to be a very dramatic first quarter. So thanks for this. Let's now turn and focus on China. A quick question on China, which is, yeah, we know there are tensions now. How far back does this go? When did this really get started? When did conditions so begin to deteriorate and we shifted away from the responsible stakeholder narrative to the trade frustration narrative? Was it following the WTO session? That's point A is actually Peter Navarro's explanation. If you've watched the movie Death by China, which I don't recommend, but the spoiler alert is, it has enough YouTube views, thank you, but the spoiler alert is basically all bad things started to happen when China joined the WTO. The B is indigenous innovation, roughly 2006, as a policy that shocked at least American globally engaged firms. Was it Xi Jinping or was it the election of President Trump? That's, well, the audience is fairly sophisticated in my view, which is, this has been building up for some time now. Matt and I were staff directors for an Asia Commission, and one of the conclusions about U.S.-China trade frictions that the Commission came to was, didn't really matter who was elected president. This was going to be an issue. So, Chris, do you want to give comments on this? Anything to add?
Sure. I wonder if at some level we need an all of the above answer to that to that question, because I think in the same way the security tensions and lack of strategic trust, as the Chinese sometimes say, has been building for some time. I think this has been building for some time. Wendy and I were kind of talking about this before the panel, what the school answer was, and my cut on it was sort of, I think indigenous innovation for me was the canary in the coal mine, maybe, but it turned out to be a good result. And part of the reason why it turned out to be a good result was that we worked with our allies and partners collectively on the B side and on the G side to go to the Chinese, and they were willing to then respond. I mean, and it's an interesting intellectual exercise. Should we actually be able to get that same coalition together again this time? Would China react the same way that they did before? I have my doubts. I think that there's a general consensus that since Xi Jinping came to power, there's been a stronger sort of statist feel to what China's doing, despite the third plenum decision during his time frame. And then likewise, it seems to have been exacerbated with the election of President Trump. So I think there's an underlying structural bit, but it seems to be more and more enhanced. And I think, you see both sides, in fact, increasingly loud, if you will, on the issue about the disputes and how I'm not going to cave to you, and I won't be pressured back and forth, and and that I think fuels the energy in the discussion.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, I do think, I was in the Bush NSC in the early 2000s, and I wrote probably 17 times the China trade strategy memo. So this was, definitely there were a lot of issues even back then within, minutes of their joining the WTO. So this is not new. I do think, to me, the Xi Jinping era is different. It feels different from the past, and of course the Trump era is different too. But I think that what's changed in China is pretty significant from an outsider's perspective. It feels like the path that China seemed to be heading on as they entered WTO under sort of a Zhurongji vision for China's future, Deng Xiaoping, Zhurongji maybe trajectory. That something has shifted in the last 3 or 4 years. Even Xi Jinping came in with a pretty ambitious reform program, reform Chinese style, but still I think there were some pretty positive things there that had those been followed through on would have changed the nature of this debate a little bit. But it feels like China has diverged from that pretty significantly for potentially their own good reasons. But I think that has made this conversation more difficult than it, I think, would have been.
And just to add to that, a key question then now is, okay, Xi Jinping won, he has all the marbles. What's he going to do with them? And I think if you look at it in quadrants, foreign policy, military security, inside China, domestic politics, and economics, the biggest unknown one is economics, which direction they're going to go. You see very mixed signals coming out of the Party Congress. The promotion of somebody like Liu He, Xi Jinping's kind of chief economic reform muse, to the Politburo is a very encouraging sign. There's some indication that, okay, the politics are over, and those economic challenges that you've been putting off, you now have to grapple with. So let's see what they do.
Yes.
Go ahead, Wendy.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say that yes, China is welding more its weight, the Belt Road, the amount of dollars it's investing, but is it working out for them? I'm not so sure. I was at a conference in Poland, and it was basically just Eastern Europeans, and they called it their Davos East, and one of the panels was called the Red Elephants. And I said, what's a red elephant? Well, the red elephant is like a white elephant, but it's Chinese money that's gone into something, puts the country in debt, in big infrastructure, and they become dependent on the Chinese. And they were upfront about this, that they were not keen. They were all being offered blandishments of funding, but they were very wary, much more wary than they would be, say, of American money or, say, what they call back Marshall Fund. You never got that kind of approach. So, and I was in Africa, in Kenya, and similar kind of thing. There's a much greater animosity, having had experience with the Chinese. So, yes, I think that they are, but are they creating, is there anything remotely like for either Russia or China, the American alliance system and friends? No.
Good point. Wendy.
If I can just add the TPP, and if you wind the clock back 2 years, right after we had completed TPP, and you saw country after country, particularly in Southeast Asia, put their hands up and say they were interested in TPP. I happened to have left USTR right around then and went to Beijing, and it was incredible. Everyone was reading TPP. They were trying to understand not only what the countries had agreed to, but I was getting a lot of questions. What would China have to do? And so I think there was a window there that has closed since then. But I would just say, so when people say the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, I think during those first 5 years, as a result of the reforms announced at the third plenum, the TPP conclusion, there were still opportunities and windows were open. And unfortunately now I think we're headed towards a path of friction on the trade front with China.
A very interesting insight. I hadn't seen it that way, but I'm glad you raised that, because there probably was a moment where there was an inflection, but you could take a different trajectory off it, so.
Yeah, I mean, 2013, it was early 2013 that Japan said that it was going to join TPP, and I think that had a real shockwave effect. I mean, I don't know what Chris feels, but I noticed it in Beijing that people suddenly realized, not because of the obvious reasons of China and Japan tension, but because now you had a huge economic group that was going to be writing the rules, and China needed to, understand what was going on in that group, if not be part of it. And so I think it changed and maybe fed into the third plenum reforms later.
I think that's right. The simplest way to put it is that, it's a fool's errand for us to think that we can get inside China's internal game and, mess around with what they're doing. However, TPP, I would argue, as a vehicle, was our best opportunity to bend the trajectory of that arc that they're already on, in a direction that's more favorable toward the rest of us.
I'd ask the others, do you think we'll get a TPP 11?
I hope so, but I don't know if all 11 would be there. Even a TPP 9 or 10 would be helpful, but it's a different animal.
I say yes.
I don't think so.
What's the bidding in Canada on that, Colin?
Well, initially I thought not, but of late I'm thinking yes, and starting to hear from the Koreans and Indonesians that they'd be 12, 13, and then there'd be docking provision for the United States when a change of administration.
Wow.
I was in Tokyo last week and I met with the TPP 11 team. They're working really hard to bring this together, and it's amazing watching Japan play that, as someone who's negotiated with Japan for many, many years, who always had defensive interests in these trade negotiations, to watch them now play a leadership role when all of a sudden a problem between, let's say, Canada and Vietnam now is Japan's problem, because that's what leadership means. I'm very optimistic that they're going to have a very positive announcement on the margins of the APEC meeting, and I wish them the best of luck. And I also wish we could have been there, but...
Canada and Mexico went in this kind of defensively, came in late, but my sense is that we're into this, and we would like this to succeed, and Abe's victory, I think, strengthens his hand, and so, again, we'll see, but there is certainly more momentum than there was 6 months ago or 9 months ago.
That's great. Having a seat at the table means picking up the check once in a while, so that's right. So, okay, let's move on. Now let's talk about what really happens when disputes intensify. This is sort of the story of trade disputes, is that they tend to deteriorate, and sometimes fairly rapidly. Now, in the days before our current modern era, it often resulted in shooting wars. In fact, I would note to interest, the old-fashioned trade agreement was the Treaty of Breda in 1637 between Holland and the United Kingdom, and the issue was nutmeg. But there were ships being sunk over nutmeg. So, in any case, so what's going to happen in terms of the U.S.-China conflict, if you can call it that? How likely is it to escalate? So it really goes to low to very high. We may get our normal distribution here again, but so the audience is hopeful. I would take that. Actions, there'll be actions, but there's some sub rosa discussions to manage escalation. I would consider that, while it's the midpoint of this chart, I would consider that a fairly rosy scenario, given how these things have worked out in the past. They usually get out of control. One of the most interesting things I've read was the legislative history of Smoot-Hawley. the Trade Act of 1930, which deepened and lengthened the Great Depression. And it started out as a very small bill, but they had enough special pleaders over the time. As the hearings expanded, they went on for weeks, and by the time they addressed everybody's concern, we had raised tariffs in the United States by a massive amount and basically stopped trade at exactly the wrong moment. But so these things can get out of control. But let's hear the opinions of the panel.
But in the post-war period, you know, we've generally pulled back from that, and even with Japan, when we had such severe tensions and gave, you know, Wendy in particular and me a little bit of a lifetime employment opportunity dealing with those issues. You know, we didn't actually go to war, and so I'd be cautious about even the, you know, questioning the title of this panel about jumping to say we're headed towards a trade war. I think the likelihood is not, because, you know, there are incentives for people to pull back. But I do think with China, this is a pretty tense situation, and the size of China, the nature of the challenge with the future economy at stake, and with investment flows being a part of this story as well, because U.S. business in China has been the pillar of support for this relationship, which is different from Japan. Japan, you had the alliance to stabilize the relationship, but business wasn't really that bought in because they couldn't invest in Japan. It's still very difficult to invest in Japan. But in China, that's been the ballast for the relationship. If that gets eroded, that's a real problem for the overall relationship. And then inbound investment from China is also, you know, potentially, as it did with Japan, going to cause some irrational and in some cases rational reactions that are going to, I think, feed this tension. So it is a tense situation, but I also think at the end of the day, both sides are going to want to pull back from war.
It's interesting because I think that is in some ways President Trump's operating style. Talk tough and then hedge, okay? And I mean, there are a lot of policies. Consider the UN Climate Change Convention, Paris Accord, okay? Look at the tweet stream. We're pulling out of the Paris Accord because it's bad for the United States, but we're open to renegotiating, okay? Or deferred access for childhood arrivals, deferred action for childhood arrivals, so-called DACA, very sympathetic class of immigration law. And the president's like, I'm terminating it, but we're going to let it run for 6 months, but I want Congress to fix it, and if they don't fix it, I'll fix it. What's that mean? Okay, but so that actually may get us to the midpoint of this more in a somewhat abrupt way. But Chris, does China actually care about this enough to worry?
I think they do care about it quite a bit for a couple of reasons. One, fundamentally, I think there's a couple interesting factors that we're going to know more about in the next 48 hours. You know, one is, what tone does President Trump strike? He's going to talk about this issue. Is he going to do it mostly privately with Xi Jinping, or is he going to do it, you know, more publicly? I think that's important. Two, I think that the Chinese, for their own domestic purposes and in an effort to maintain stability in bilateral relations in the run-up to the Party Congress, were willing to take a fair amount without complaining. I think they've been suppressing some of their reactions. They want to use the summit, I think, to push the reset button, if you will, on the trade relationship. They hope by signing deals rather than by talking about market access issues. If they're successful in that, then I think the tension goes down, you know, quite a bit. If they're not, then I think we might see more of a reaction. And then I think the other issue is, you know, one of the reasons they've felt more comfortable doing the modest deleveraging in their financial sector they've been doing for the last several months, what appears to be gearing up for a much more robust deleveraging effort in the spring focused on state-owned enterprises and provincial governments, is because of the very favorable world trade situation. The export picture gives them the confidence they need to be able to do that. If that starts to come into doubt, then I think these tensions could really amplify.
Thanks. Let's go on to the final question before we get to your questions, which is, how will our partners act if the U.S.-China dispute intensifies? Now, we've already basically stipulated that it's probably a low likelihood, but if it does intensify, will our partners stay on the sidelines? Will the retaliation spill over and hurt partners? Certainly with integrated supply chains in North America, you'd expect harm to Mexico and Canada. Will the partners, the middle powers, so to speak, intervene to try to manage things before it gets out of hand? will our partners actually become targets? Will Japan, say, or Korea become targets of retaliation by China, or will the U.S. target China allies? And finally, is there the risk of piling on? So it looks, I mean, A is sort of the hedging strategy that, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, that actually strategy, A actually makes sense. Try to stay on the sidelines, try to minimize damage, because you may be a U.S. ally, you may be a U.S. trading partner, but your biggest trading partner is probably China, if you're anywhere in the Asia Pacific. So that all makes sense. Colin, let me start with you as an ally and partner country.
Well, you don't want it to break down. That's the first. And so, can you be helpful? And I think the discussions this next week are, you say, absolutely important between what the president says and what Xi Jinping. But it's you can be sure that all the other leaders are talking about, and what can they do to help manage this to a positive outcome? Because if it goes badly, it goes badly for everybody.
Other comments? Wendy?
I would just comment on I'm surprised on C, how low that is, because Scott, you mentioned, I mean,
yeah.
the integrated supply chains in the region mean if we were to raise our tariffs against China on certain products, given all the trade with intermediate products and supply chains, I think this would quickly affect China's other trading partners in the region. Yes. And for most countries in the region, China is their largest trading partner. I would also just underscore something that we really haven't talked about. There's the formal public retaliation raising tariffs, but there's also ways to hit your trading partners in more opaque ways and to harass them. All of a sudden you're not getting the license to operate, a certain company. Right. All of a sudden you can't get the parts for your auto production plant. And we've seen that in China vis-a-vis Korea, in response to the deployment of THAAD in Korea. Just this past week now, apparently there's some understanding has been reached between Korea and China. I don't think we know the details of that yet. We'll see how it plays out. But I would just emphasize there are a lot of other ways that this retaliation happens. Having worked at USTR for a long time, sometimes we would get out there, companies would come in, we have a horrible problem, please work with the other government, either through the WTO or through a trade law, only to come in a month later and to say, well, we're working it out on our own. And it was clear to us that there was just a real fear of retribution. Yeah. And so I think all of these issues just need to be considered when questions like this are put up on the screen.
And as Wendy says, many forums, when I was in Korea earlier this year, the Chinese tourists had dried up, and it was very much in reaction to as one of these other things that they were doing.
Yeah. Right. And it definitely, there's a lot about the extent to which global value chains actually create sort of diffuse enough interests that you get others involved in it. I mean, 100% tariff on mobile phones from China. Those phones are assembled in China, but probably have components from 7, 8 other economies, including the United States in some cases. So the impacts are going to be interesting. And Wendy's right about the sub rosa stuff. I've experienced regimes where there's duty-free access, but it requires a license. And funny thing, nobody got a license for this last year. So, strange how that happens. In any case,
can I just one final point, which is I think no question everybody gets hurt if we slide into sort of any kind of tit for tat trade tension. But it highlights that C is the answer that allies and partners should be moving towards, is trying to help intervene and change this dynamic, and that's trying to pull both of us back from each other, but also moving forward with things like TPP-11 and other arrangements. I actually think that's helpful when allies and partners move forward with trade liberalizing, good rulemaking, high standard rulemaking agreements. That's a contribution that allies and partners can make even while this sort of tense situation unfolds.
Well, thanks for your input in the clicker questions. I had a former boss before I got into this line of work who told me I always manage to see dark at the end of the tunnel, so I hope we haven't been too pessimistic here. But in any case, what we'd like to do is open the floor to your questions. The basically 3 rules for Q&A. First, wait for the microphone because we're being webcast live. Want to make sure your question is heard by the online audience. Second, when you are called on, please introduce yourself and let us know your organization. And third, I call it the Alex Trebek rule. Make sure your question is in the form of a question. So, yes, sir.
Hi, Chen Wei from China Daily. I have a question about, I think panelists mentioned a little bit, but when President Trump was elected almost a year ago, I mean, tomorrow actually, when he landed in China, everybody was scared about trade war. I mean, asking you about trade war. But I don't think anyone is worried about that anymore. So I think, is that a sort of a pleasant surprise to you? I mean, experts, trade experts, China experts, that how Trump managed the U.S.-China relationship. So in going forward, Wilbur Ross also talked about the visit, U.S. seek immediate tangible results. Policy issue would take time. So that shows the U.S. has some patience. So do you think, going forward, actually Trump will be able to manage the relationship, U.S.-China relationship, trade relationship relatively well, to the surprise of many? Thank you.
I think you're right that of course, many of the things that candidate Trump said he was going to do regarding China and trade, he has not done, with one big exception that I always flag, which is pulling out of TPP, which was a China-related action. Just to remind people, as we've discussed before, that was a big problem in our, a big move. But other than that, he hasn't put 45% tariffs on China. He hasn't called them a currency manipulator. The evidence helps, in terms of pulling back from those things, because doing those things would have been, not evidence-based and would have caused damage. But I think, as Joanne Lai may have said about the French Revolution, it's too early to tell whether it's been successful. I think there is still a significant and maybe underappreciated risk, perhaps in China, I think in the markets, of some action to come. It feels to me like we may be, like there's a storm brewing, and that we may get through this trip without too much than the occasional, like in Japan, rhetoric, but not real action. But I think afterwards, I think there's a substantial, greater than zero risk that there's going to be some action, and this whole conversation is going to look different.
Don't you also think North Korea played a role in the kind of moderating, as much as you could, maybe the word is the wrong one, but that played into it?
Most definitely.
Definitely, and I think a lot of it, in my mind, to Matt's point, I think the storm is the clouds are gathering. I think that's true. So a lot of it's going to depend on what China puts on the table here in the next few days. I think if it looks like things that we saw in the early harvest process, which were largely commitments made in the BIT negotiations with the United States earlier or even earlier, so it has sort of a rewarmed feeling to it, then I think we're headed for trouble. If it's something more significant, then maybe less so.
Yeah, Bill Eichward, consultant. Question on sort of the future on state-owned enterprises and the provisions. TPP had a critical provision on state-owned enterprises, and that was not only a signal for the 12, but a signal to China as to how it might proceed. So I'm just wondering, in the absence of TPP, or the absence of the United States in a TPP agreement, how does a 10 or an 11 deal with that provision? And also, what lesson do you think China is learning from that? So,
perhaps I can start. My understanding in the TPP, in the TPP 11 negotiations, they're kind of at the final stages of agreeing which provisions will be suspended, and that deal would go into effect. And then, if the U.S. were to rejoin, all of the TPP 12 provisions would come into effect with the U.S. With respect to which provisions countries are trying to take off the table, my understanding is, at least with respect to the rules on state-owned enterprises, that those will remain pretty much intact. What's in play is certain country or countries are looking perhaps to take certain entities off their their entity list, which is appended to state-owned enterprises. It's a wonky answer, but that's the answer.
Let's do them in sequence. Yes, ma'am, and gentleman, one row ahead of you. Let's take both questions, and then we'll come to this side of the room.
Miracle Coons, Fulbright scholar. So twofold questions. First one is, who gets hurt more? And I studied international security and diplomacy. Who gets more in case of complete disintegration of the U.S. from main treaty agreements? And second question is, what is the chance of businesses to act independently when, we can control demand, right? Or it takes very long time to control it, but we can't do supply. So what is the leeway for businesses to act on? Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug Redeker, International Capital Strategies and Brookings. I was surprised at the TPP 11 question where I think all of the panelists agreed it was more likely to pass than not, except for Chris. And I just wanted to get an explanation from Chris as to why he takes a contrary view.
My sense is that I think there's more, there is momentum, and obviously these guys know a lot more about it than I do. I think there's much deeper suspicion among the other parties of Japan in the lead than is easily manifestable. And then secondly, I think absent the United States, does it really make sense? I think that's really an issue. I actually think it's more likely, in some ways, Japan does a bilateral free trade agreement with the U.S. and then attempts to use that as the backdoor to bring in the other TPP parties. But
okay, and then a question on who gets hurt and what the role of business might be. Well, my point of view would be that, look, the consumer gets hurt first. All right, in terms of lower living standards. That's who is the beneficiary for all this openness that we have now. And Globalization 2.0 benefited the consumer. So that's the first harm. In terms of businesses, what's interesting to me is how resilient supplier-customer relationships are over time, and they can take interruptions. So it depends on the size of the disconnect, maybe the size of the retaliation in a dispute that has tariffs applied. Maybe but think about the NAFTA, for instance. If you were to raise tariffs to MFN levels, U.S. MFN tariffs are fairly low. It would definitely be disruptive. But what's happened over the last 23 years in North America is they've used this rule set to build their supplier bases, to develop relationships, to serve customers, and those underlying connections would not immediately disappear. In fact, there'd be efforts to work around it. And so, if the tariffs go up, probably you'll get a currency adjustment that will deal with some of the differential. But a lot of these things are based on the private interaction, and for me that reveals the nature of trade is so different than what's talked about in Washington. The nature of trade is it's mutually beneficial, voluntary exchange between individuals and firms. It's not a win-lose struggle between economies, and so I would hold out hope, but disruption is I think in the offing. So we have two questions here. I have lots of questions, but
Scott, I'd just add to that there's been a kind of a chilling effect on investment in the short term.
Yes.
I think that as you say, they're resilient, but the investment decisions, we're certainly noticing this on the NAFTA.
This is one of the problems.
Anecdotal.
Exactly. One of the problems with NAFTA now is investment is probably on the sideline given the uncertainty of the future. So if you talk to like Toyota, they are at 100% of capacity of Tacoma trucks now. They are selling every one they can make. They need to expand one of their facilities. Do you expand the one in the United States or the one in Mexico? Tough question, but up here in the green, and then there was a gentleman in the back if you still have the question. But go ahead. Please.
Hi, Giovanna Cinelli, attorney. First of all, I want to thank everyone. The panel has been outstanding and very insightful. I'd like to ask a question about a player that hasn't really been mentioned, which is Congress in the United States. The laws that you were mentioning, 201, 301, 232, all generated from Congress, albeit with some interest from the executive branch. And what we're seeing nowadays in legislation on the sanction side, where Chinese banks are being named, for example, indirectly in relation to North Korea sanctions, Can you talk a little bit about how you see the U.S. Congress impacting potential trade wars or actions that could be taken, please? Thank you.
Yes, did you still have a question in the back? You had your hand up a while ago. We'll take that one too. A great question on Congress and their role in this.
My name is Duncan Brown from Johns Hopkins. We used to talk about alliances being trade alliance, economic alliances, military alliances being formed against the United States. And the classic example was the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And a lot of that was in retaliation to either trade or economic issues, sanctions, for example, U.S. policy of using all elements of power, those sorts of things, and now trade issues. Is that still on the table, or we're not hearing much of that anymore?
Question about sort of non-aligned parties or other alliances. In terms of the Congress, I'll give you a cynical view, which is at the moment, look, our game scheme was created since Franklin Roosevelt with a free trade president and a protectionist Congress. That's where the Trade Act of '74 came from. The Trade Act of '88 came out of a Congress who had protectionist instincts, trying to apply pressure to the executive, who was inclined toward free trade as a tool of diplomacy. Okay, the creation of the USTR was because Congress thought the State Department was giving away the store. so this is the long history of that. That's been the game. The game has now been reversed with a president with protectionist instincts and on paper a relatively free trade Congress. The two cautions. My skepticism about the Congress acting is twofold. First, majorities in Congress, despite with the same party affiliation as the president, have some areas where they are inclined to work together, read that tax reform, and areas where there is disagreement, read that trade, and particularly NAFTA. I think Congress will be very reluctant to intervene in the place where they disagree until they get some of the things they agree on advanced. So I think we're at a dangerous moment right at the moment in terms of Congress asserting its prerogatives on trade. Second, many Republican members of Congress look forward to the votes of Trump voters in November 2018. And I think many Republican members of Congress I talk to don't really understand these voters and don't know the consequences of separating from the president on this issue or any other. And so they are reluctant to be particularly vocal at this point in time. Now we'll see. There's a start of noise from the Farm Belt. Okay, American farmers will probably be the first affected by any trade dispute. They'll be first affected by the termination of NAFTA in terms of prices will decline immediately, markets will be lost, and farm state senators have unusual influence. It's hard for any Republican president to pass any bill without farm state Republican senators. So there's an opportunity there. At the moment, they're the ones who I'm sensing some alarm. So far, no formal action, but with regard to the Congress as a whole, particularly the majority, I think they're on the sidelines for at least a while, and it adds to the tension in the situation. I don't know if anybody else differs with that.
I just had one quick point on Congress from a different angle, which is that I think this is an area where China sometimes doesn't fully appreciate how broad the sentiment about some of these things in the U.S. is. I think they think it's Peter Navarro and, from their perspective, 3 other crazy guys. We're about to see significant CFIUS legislation coming, and it's going to be targeted right at them. And the administration, actually, my understanding initially was sort of no, it's got to be global. And Congress said fine, and then you come up with a white list that basically exempts everybody except for China. So I think their activism in this area may be stronger.
Scott, I just say
question from the back on.
I'm just going to that Canada traditionally looks at Congress as the protectionist, and that the administration was our shield and our entree into, and that's basically how we did the FTA and the NAFTA. But it's interesting. Since Mr. Trump, our Prime Minister, when he comes down now, he goes up to the Capitol Hill, as do the cabinet ministers. They're up there on a regular basis because we recognize that that's a potential counterweight. And so the last time he came, he spent actually longer with the House Ways and Means than he did with the President.
Quickly, I think it's interesting to note that for the NAFTA negotiations, the executive branch is using trade promotion authority, But for chorus, they've chosen not to.
Right.
And I would just put on everyone's radar screen, people think it's a given that this president will ask for renewal of trade promotion authority later
That's right.
next year.
He may not ask.
He
and
may not ask.
get it if
He may
does
not
that.
ask, and he may not get it.
Right. Any comment from the panel on the question on sort of non-U.S. alliances? Chris?
I would just say that I think China in some ways is taking the lead on that, not from a hostile point of view, but when it looks at things like BRICS or COFAC, its agreements with Africa, FOCAC rather, it looked like a bit of an alphabet soup. I think they've decided that Belt and Road is the sort of unifying principle to manage a lot of this. So I think you'll see that be the central focus from their point of view on how to manage that.
I'm under oath to end on time, so despite many questions, let me take one more, and the gentleman in front here.
Hello, my name is Atarv. I'm a student at Thomas Jefferson High School. Kind of following off on that last question, given the rise of non-U.S. alliances, for example, the recent EU-Japan alliance, and more recently the China New Silk Road Initiative, these huge alliances with non-U.S. Countries, do you think that the United States will eventually get sidestepped by the international community and start to see a decline, even if it's following a short-term economic growth?
I mean, that's a real risk right now. Those things are moving forward. I wouldn't call them alliances, but there are arrangements being made that aren't including the United States, and they are providing both benefits and opportunities for those players and risks. That's another thing. There are things that the U.S. has at stake with some of those arrangements. For example, EU-Japan, they've agreed on, at least tentatively agreed on, a set of data privacy, it gets a little wonky, but rules that are sort of European style that are really problematic from a U.S. point of view. Similarly, on geographic indications, Parmesan and Champagne, the Europeans want special protections for those, which is going to hurt American, Wisconsin cheese farmers, So there are stakes there if we're not involved. This is an important general point, which is I think we often focus on the sort of things we say and do and tweet in a positive sense, but there's also a real set of risks or opportunity costs if we're not doing things, if we're not leading, TPP arrangements or some alternative to that, or, we're not trying to shape the rules on things like, agriculture, trade, and so forth. So that is, I think that's a real risk in the short term.
Exist inside the Beltway. Nobody really understands it. But if you look at the disappointment with the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, what happened? We negotiated with Korea, concluded, and then sat on it for 4 years while Europe signs the agreement. European exports are a lot like U.S. exports. There was a lot of trade diversion to European suppliers while the U.S. was sitting on the sideline. So this stuff is real. In any case, thank you for your attention. It's been an exciting event. I hope you liked it. Okay, they liked it. So, have a good day.